strange that it is cold like that. That it's cold. I mean, it's 70 in here. At least that's what the thermometer says. Or well, it's not really even a thermometer. Well, yeah, I guess it is a thermometer. It has to have something in there. Anyway, stop babbling. So this is week 3 of Paley's. What's that?
Thank you for the project last week. I sent it to the students in the Philippines, and they're delighted to get it. They've gotten the simple English version of this.
Oh.
And so they'll be able to get a lot of good out of it. I started reading it, and I believe they'll be able to comprehend it.
Well, great. Yeah, I keep meaning to ask if you had gotten that.
Yeah, I sent it to them.
So there was, and it's linked on the website, so you can just go and read it directly. And there's a side-by-side, so you can see the original, the more modern, and then the simple English, which is cool because...
Well, I had just requested that they had a chance they went to the website and they downloaded the second link, which was the simple English.
The PDF.
The PDF file,
sure.
And just keep in their records and go in their notebook. They're keeping a notebook for me for the class.
Oh, yeah.
So,
which website is this? Ours?
Yes. Yeah, you can see it on the church website.
Yeah, if you'll go, there should be a link. Let's see.
On our homepage, right?
Yeah, it's not on the homepage. That's why I probably need to. I didn't really think about that. But let's see, where is it? See if I can see where I sent it to you. And then I can give it to whoever might need it.
Was it .org/evidences or Paley? I can't remember.
Yeah.
Someone of them, I can't remember.
So I find where I sent it to you. I think I'm getting close.
The simple English version looked like a much shorter version too. Is that because did it just summarize, or is that how much shorter it is to put it in simple English than to use the torturous English of the 18th century?
Yeah.
Wow.
So if you go to it's buchananchurchofchrist.org. So if you go there, and then it's evidences-of-Christianity. So www.buchananchurchofchrist.org/evidences-of-Christianity. And then if you go to that page, that gives you all of the...
You'll see a picture of Paley himself.
Yep. So it gives 2 different links. There's one that is the simple English, just a PDF. And then there's one that is, it's actually an HTML file. You can read it just right there on the web page. And it has the original version, or you can look at the modern English or the simple English version. And like, for instance, I mean, if you're interested in the difference. So you can't see it here, maybe on the page, but there's a little button here in the upper left. And if you tap on it, it gives you a table of contents that you can scroll through. And at the top, there's a simple, modern, original, modern plus simple, original plus modern, and all 3. And all 3 would give you like side by side of all the different versions. But to give you an example, the original Paley would read something like this. The Honorable and Right Reverend James York, D.D., Lord Bishop of Ely. My Lord, when 5 years ago an important station in the University of Cambridge awaited your lordship's disposal, you were pleased to offer it to me. The circumstances under which this offer was made demand a public acknowledgement. So you can see the formality of it there. That might have been slang back then, though. I don't know. So I'm going to go to the simple English. Modern is very similar to it. It just cleans up some of the commas and semicolons and makes it a little easier to read. But here's Here's the simple English. To the Honorable and Right Reverend James York, D.D., Lord Bishop of Ely. My Lord, 5 years ago you gave me an important job at Cambridge University. I want to thank you publicly for this. I had never met you before. I had no friends who could speak for me. You knew me only from my work as a teacher and from some books I had written. You thought these books were useful. I mean, it's just very, very simplified.
English is a second language for them, so that's just what they need.
Exactly. So I thought that was pretty cool. And I did nothing other than instruct the AI to generate that for me. Now, I took the original text and I fed it in and I told it to go chapter by chapter and generate, what I wanted. And then I compiled it. And so it's a process, but not nearly the. Yeah, this is basically, all of this whole thing, the presentation and all of the formal text is all, ultimately generated by the AI. So, I interacted with it to get what I wanted out of it, and it generated this study for me based on the conversations that I've had with it about the text. And so it's generating a proper, Church of Christ view, as opposed to the Catholic or, I'm sure it could have pumped out the Baptist view of this document too. I'm sure there are many people who have. But anyway, so yeah, that is just full disclosure, whatever. This is Evidences of Christianity, Week 3, The Witnesses Who Suffered, Part 2, Enemy Witnesses Confirm the Persecution. So, let's do a quick review of where we have been. In week 1, we established that faith and evidence are not enemies. We often like to make that statement. They clearly work together. We saw that the Bible actually commands us to give reasons for our hope, and we learned that Christianity stands or falls on historical facts. We don't just expect people to take what we say at face value. We expect to have to prove at some level the reality of the gospel and Christianity. So that was week 1. Last week, we looked at the transformation of the apostles. We saw men who were cowards, hiding behind locked doors, become bold preachers willing to face death. We saw Thomas the skeptic become a worshiper after touching Jesus' wounds. We saw 500 people who claimed to see Jesus alive at one time. And we asked, what could explain this transformation? The only reasonable answer, they saw what they said they saw. Jesus rose from the dead, and it changed everything. So this week, part 2, the question before us, did they really suffer for their testimony, and how do we know this? So tonight we need to go further, because you might be thinking, okay, the Bible says the apostles were persecuted. The Bible says they were willing to die, but isn't that just what you'd expect Christians to write? Isn't that biased? And that's a fair question. That's a great question, really, because if all we had were Christian sources telling us about Christian persecution, we might legitimately wonder whether they were exaggerating, maybe inflating their martyrdoms to make their movement look more impressive. So tonight we're going to do something remarkable. We're going to look at what Christianity's enemies said. We're going to examine hostile witnesses, Roman historians who hated Christianity, Jewish writers who opposed it, pagan sources who mocked it. And here's what we're going to discover. Even the people who wanted to disprove Christianity, who had every reason to minimize or deny Christian suffering, admitted that Christians were being tortured and executed. And they admitted that Christians could escape this suffering simply by denying Christ, but they refused to do so. That's critical, don't you think? Regardless of whether or not these witnesses saw the original miracles is not really relevant. The fact that they saw people willing to die for the things that they saw, the things that they had experienced firsthand, that's what's important. Because as we established last week, people are willing to, die for a cause that they believe in, but they're not willing. I don't know anybody that's willing to die in a cause that they know for a fact to be a lie. And if you did not see Christ risen from the dead, if you didn't see these miracles, if you made it all up, you would not be willing to die for that, would you? You would have to be insane. An insane person might, but not hundreds and hundreds of people. They didn't all experience the same supposed delusions. So, this is Paley's genius. He doesn't just quote the Bible, he marshals the testimony of hostile witnesses. It's like in a courtroom. If the prosecution's own witnesses confirm the defendant's story, the case is over. So let's start by seeing what the Bible claims, and then we'll see what Christianity's enemies confirmed. So let's start with what our own scriptures say. The book of Acts gives us a detailed account of the early persecution. In Acts 4, Peter and John are arrested for preaching about Jesus. You remember that from the Sunday morning study. They're brought before the Sanhedrin, the same body that condemned Jesus. They're ordered to stop speaking about him. They refuse. We cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard. They're threatened and released. Acts 5, all the apostles are arrested this time, imprisoned, brought before the Sanhedrin again. This time they're beaten with rods, flogged, and then released with another command to stop preaching. And what do? Acts 5:42 tells us, every day in the temple and from house to house, they did not cease teaching and preaching that the Christ is Jesus. Then in Acts 7, Stephen, one of the early deacons, is stoned to death, the first Christian martyr, and who's watching approvingly? A young man named Saul of Tarsus, who would later become the Apostle Paul. Acts 12, King Herod Agrippa decides to please the Jews by persecuting Christians. He has James, the brother of John, killed with the sword, just executed. One of the 12 apostles dead. Then Herod arrests Peter, planning the same fate. Peter escapes, miraculously, the text says, but the threat was real. And then we have Paul's own testimony. So let's read from 2 Corinthians 11, 23 through 28. Paul is defending his apostleship, and he lists his sufferings. Are they servants of Christ? I am a better one. I am talking like a madman, with far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings, and often near death. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. That's quite a litany of things, right? And again, consider what Paul could have been had he not gone down that road. He would have been well respected. He would have been one of the fat cats, right? He would have been high, very high up in Jewish society. But instead, he's imprisoned, beaten, all of these things, right? 5 times beaten with 39 lashes, 3 times beaten with rods, once stoned and left for dead, 3 shipwrecks, constant danger, hunger, cold, sleepless nights. And he's writing this in the middle of his ministry. More suffering was still to come. So that's what the Bible claims. The picture is clear. The apostles and early Christians faced severe, sustained persecution. I mean, and I don't mean this badly, because I'm pointing the finger at me too, but the government says, well, maybe you ought not to come together to worship on Sunday because of, a souped up flu. And we go along with it, And why? it's not that we were necessarily afraid of the flu, but, there is that overarching threat of, the government looking askance at you. And yet, and of course, we didn't do that for long. We did it, a couple of times, maybe just because we thought, well, maybe better be safe than sorry. But when it became clear that this was not the kind of threat that people said it was, then we said, forget that. We're coming together. We don't care. But I mean, these people beaten, thrown in jail. At some point, you would think that if they really didn't believe, if they were half-hearted, if they were lukewarm, they would have said, you know what? We'll try to get together when we can, when there's not, the heat's not on. But they persisted and kept going.
I don't want to get us off this subject, but you
Yeah.
mentioned in that list he was beaten with lashes 3 times, I think, and you mentioned by rods. Does anybody know how that's different? I know about the lashes, if it's like a Roman kind of scourging type thing, but
I mean, lashes would be whips, I'm assuming,
that's
and
what
the
it was.
rod would be like a hard.
Stick or a pole.
Yeah, I mean that's.
What that
I don't know exactly what that is. I mean, it's some kind of corporal punishment that we probably need to use in public schools, but I'm sure it was more severe. I mean, Jesus was beaten with the cat of nine tails, right? Or am I saying that right? I'm sorry, it just sounds weird when I say it out loud, but that had the little hooks and barbs in it. That the one that they beat him with, but this to my knowledge was not that, but bad enough.
That might have killed him that many times.
Yeah, exactly, and it might have killed Jesus, the blood loss, but of course it didn't. But I mean it, you know. Anyway, far worse than anything I have ever had happen to me, and I'm sure you've had. The worst that we've had is someone maybe saying something mean to us, or you the government trying to keep us from coming together, something like that. But nothing, we have not had somebody standing at the door preventing us from coming in, or waiting to arrest us when we came to the door, that sort of thing. So again, these people were committed. They were absolutely committed. And why were they committed? They were committed because they knew what they saw. They knew what they had seen and experienced, and they believed it. So, here's the critical question. Is this just Christian propaganda? Well, I think it's ridiculous to even ask that question, because why is Paul, who's been through all this already, why is he not throwing in the towel and just going back and being, a Jewish authority and being a teacher? He knew that there was a reason for him to keep running this race. He knew that there was a prize there at the end of it. Something happened to him that convinced him of that. And we know what that was. It was the road to Damascus. And it was everything, subsequent to that. And it wasn't just that one event. I mean, it was all of the things. It was the good and the bad, right? So it's not just that he had that one good experience, or that one, miraculous experience on the road to Damascus. It was all of the other things, all of the other events that happened during his ministry. So it wasn't just that, he had this one event that maybe he misunderstood what happened. Maybe he had a stroke or something. It wasn't just that, because you would think that a man that spends that much time, if he's not convinced of what happened, and if he's not convinced daily that he is doing the right thing by the things that are happening to him, the experiences that he is having, the miracles that are, happening around him and by him, that he would have given up. Sometimes I wonder if stuff that I remember in my past actually happened. Man, that was so long ago. But these are not these are not those kind of things. I don't know if I'm explaining myself right, but this is something that was so profound. And it wasn't just that one-time event. It was the thing that kept on persisting in his life. Even with all the bad things, there was such a good component to what was happening to him that it made him persist. So here's where it gets really interesting, though. So, aside from what he says he experienced, let's talk about the enemy witnesses. Now we turn to the hostile witnesses, and let's understand how remarkable this is. These are not Christians writing Christian history. These are Rome's finest historians, senators, governors, educated men writing for educated audiences, and they hated Christianity. So let's let that sink in. They viewed Christians as superstitious fools. Yes, sir.
The reason why this springing off of what you said the Bible witness is about what happened, comparing it to these hostile witnesses, is because in recent years, I think in a way, Haley was very much, Paley was very much ahead of his time because he sort of anticipated this kind of objection made by the higher critics
Mm-hmm.
who say that the early church actually made up the story that there was some event. What it was, we can't really be sure. It's just lost in the shadows of history.
Mm-hmm.
Something happened with the Jesus movement. Later, within a few short decades, it had morphed into something entirely different from the original brand. And that at that time, they started documenting their story. So it naturally alleges that the gospel accounts, Acts, and the epistles are very late documents compared to the traditional dating of them. And that the early church put words in Jesus' mouth, put words in the writing the speeches of Acts, whoever that author really was, whether it was Luke or not.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why a really hard-hearted critic could say the biblical witness can't necessarily be the final word on this point because they did, like you said earlier, propaganda used that term. They would call that propaganda in quotation. I'm sorry to go so long.
Oh, no.
But that's why this is so important to show that the very story told about the earliest days is the story corroborated by people who had no vested interest in it whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they have no vested interest, as you say, in verifying any of these facts. They were just reporting history and as a hostile witness. So now we turn to the hostile witnesses, not, again, Christians, but enemies of Christianity, who viewed Christians as superstitious fools, who called Christianity a pernicious superstition, a mischievous superstition. They thought Christians were troublemakers, atheists, because they weren't polytheists, right? Because they didn't worship the Roman gods, and enemies of civilization. But even while despising Christianity, they confirmed the facts. They confirmed Christians were being persecuted. They confirmed Christians were dying, and they confirmed Christians could escape by simply denying their faith, but they refused to do so. So this is like having the prosecutor's witnesses confirm your alibi. This is devastating evidence. Let's start with Tacitus. Publius Cornelius Tacitus, born around AD 56, was one of Rome's greatest historians. He was a Roman senator, a government official, a man of the highest social standing. He wrote his Annals, a history of Rome, around AD 116, about 50 years after the events he's describing. And Tacitus hated Christianity. Listen to how he describes it. A most mischievous superstition. He calls Christians a class hated for their abominations. Imagine. Compared to the Romans, come on.
They said the same thing about us. They said the same thing.
That's true. That's true. What is it? It's so backwards, right? It's so backwards because Christians stand for nothing but love and peace and understanding and, care for their fellow man. What is that saying? Your boos mean nothing to me because I've seen what you cheer for. This is the kind of people we're talking about. People that have they have temples for prostitution, right? These are the kind of people who are calling us or the Christians at that time abominable.
It's like a classic case of projection, doesn't
Yeah.
I think some of the letters from the Epstein files are coming out, some of the emails.
Yeah.
Where Mr. Jewboy talks about the glowing bus.
Yeah.
He's on us really bad. And Christians, that kind of supercilious, hateful attitude is still here today among the same class of people. And
Exactly.
now, that's not that class of Romans, were not the Jews, but they both made common cause against Christians at the time.
Yeah. I mean, it is an evil bias against, a class of people that, they were doing nothing wrong. I mean, Christians were not doing anything, actual Christians. Now there may be some, weird offshoot, maybe, Gnostic types that were doing terrible things, but, that is not the, part and parcel what Christians were doing. He says, this is not a friendly witness. This is not someone who is trying to help the Christian cause. This is a hostile source. But watch what he confirms. This is Tacitus's account. Tacitus is describing the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64 during Nero's reign. There were rumors that Nero himself had ordered the fire in order to clear land for his building projects. Sounds like what might have happened in the great state of California not recently. Interesting. Nevertheless, so Nero decided he needed a scapegoat, and he chose Christians. So let's read what Tacitus wrote. And this is graphic, but it's important to hear it because this is not from a Christian source. This is from a Roman historian who thought Christians were fools. Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, but first source of the evil, but even in Rome. The first source of the evil, but even in Rome. It's very stilted language. I might have to do that again.
In Rome, where all things, what did it say, abominable end up or something?
Yeah. So let me say that. Let me read that again. Now that I've accustomed myself to this stilted. Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, or Christ, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. So it spread to Rome, right? Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pled guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. That's pretty, Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skin of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle and was exhibiting a show in the circus while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or stood aloft on a car. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion, for it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty that they were being destroyed. So basically, this was too much even for that bloodthirsty lot. They saw what was going on to the Christians, and it actually made them feel sorry for Christians, gave them some empathy, some sympathy towards them, because it seemed like it was just put on for spectacle and to sate the endless cruelty that this man desired. So let's break down in more easily understood language what Tacitus is confirming here. First, Christians existed in large numbers in Rome by AD 64, only 30 years after Jesus' death. Second, Christ was executed under Pontius Pilate during Tiberius's reign. That matches the Gospels exactly. Third, the religion, despite being checked by Jesus' execution, broke out again and spread from Judea to Rome, which matches Acts. And fourth, Christians faced horrific persecution, covered in animal skins, torn apart by dogs, nailed to crosses, covered in pitch, and burned alive as human torches to light Nero's garden parties. And Tacitus adds this remarkable detail. Even though these were criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, in his view, Romans felt compassion for them because the cruelty was so extreme. So think about what this means. This is an enemy witness describing persecution that was deserved, in his opinion, but so brutal that even pagans who hated Christians felt sorry for them. So this confirms everything the Bible says about early Christian suffering, but it comes from someone who had every reason to minimize it, deny it, or ignore it. Pliny the Younger. Now let's look at another source. Around AD 112, about 80 years after Jesus' death, am I saying that right, Pliny?
That's what I've always thought, yeah.
Was serving as governor of Bithynia and Pontus, that's modern-day Turkey, and he had a problem. What should he do about all these Christians? So he wrote a letter to the emperor, Trajan, or Trajan, I guess. That's the way I would pronounce it if I was British, but I'll pronounce it Trajan, asking for advice. And we still have that letter. It's one of the most important non-Christian sources we have about early Christianity. So let's read some excerpts. It is my custom, my Lord, to refer to you all matters about which I am in doubt. I have never participated in trials of Christians. I therefore do not know what offenses it is the practice to punish or investigate. Meanwhile, in the case of those who were denounced to me as Christians, I have observed the following procedure. I interrogated these as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second and a third time, threatening them with punishment. Those who persisted, I ordered executed. For I had no doubt that, whatever the nature of their creed, stubbornness and inflexible obstinacy surely deserved to be punished. They asserted, however, that the sum and substance of their fault or error had been that they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves by oath not to some crime, but not to commit fraud, theft, adultery, nor falsify their trust,
Look at me in his part.
nor to refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so. This made me decide it was all the more necessary to find out what the truth was by torturing 2 female slaves who were called deaconesses. But I discovered nothing else but depraved, excessive superstition. So the fact that these people were binding themselves by oath to not commit fraud, theft, adultery, falsify their trust, nor to refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so, made them depraved and excessively superstitious.
Goodness is critiqued in the same way today.
I have to say, there's so many reasons to be so thankful to be alive at this moment in this land, in this part of the country. But just think about throughout history, just how much evil has been allowed to proliferate and to be in control and unchecked, to just torture on a whim Christians or any good person, but in particular Christians. We don't realize how good we have it, you know? And I just pray that we figure that out before we lose any more control than we have. But, you know, it takes work to do that. It takes work. It took a lot of work to get where we are. It took a lot of suffering. It took people, you know, venturing out on boats to maybe certain death, crossing the ocean. And then when they got there to forge a community out of the dust of the ground, out of the natural materials there, to survive through these brutal winters and starvation, and here we are. Well, you know what? Maybe I'll talk to so and so tomorrow. I don't really have time right now. I mean, they would be ashamed of us, don't you think? Don't they think you think that they would just spit in disgust at the very thought of what we do? Anyway, I'm sorry. I don't know. I think about these things. I don't think about this stuff all the time. I think about these things while I'm standing here, kind of stream of consciousness, and I'm disgusted with myself. I'm absolutely there's more that I should be doing, and yet anyway, we'll let that percolate. We'll let that simmer in the back of our minds while we continue on. So, let's look at what Pliny is confirming. Whoops. Yeah, I think this is it. First, Christians were numerous and widespread. He describes them as existing in cities, villages, and rural areas. He says temples had been nearly deserted because so many people had converted to Christianity. Wouldn't that be nice to see some empty denominational buildings? Second, Christians were being arrested and executed simply for being Christians, not for actual crimes, but for stubbornness in refusing to worship the emperor. And third, this is crucial, they could have escaped. They could have escaped. Pliny offered them a way out. He was being the good guy here. Hey, just deny Christ. It'll all be all right. I'll let the suffering end. All they had to do was curse Christ, offer incense to the emperor's statue, and worship the Roman gods. Do that and you go free. But they refused, even under threat of execution, even when offered a simple way to escape. They chose death. Pliny doesn't understand it. He calls it obstinacy. But what he's really describing is conviction. These people knew what they believed. They had seen the evidence. They weren't going to deny it, even to save their lives. And remember, this isn't a Christian writing this. This is a Roman governor who's ordering their executions. He has no reason to make them look heroic. He thinks they're fools. But even he confirms they could have escaped by denying Christ, and they refused. So we all are familiar with this guy, Josephus. Let's look at what this Jewish source, Josephus, has to say. Flavius Josephus was a Jewish historian writing around AD 93. He was not a Christian. He was a Pharisee who fought against Rome in the Jewish war, then switched sides and became a Roman citizen. He wrote extensive histories of the Jewish people. And in his Jewish Antiquities, he mentions Christians. Specifically, he records the death of James, the brother of Jesus. So let's read it. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So the high priest Ananus assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. Does that sound familiar? Of course it sounds familiar. Why is it significant? This is a Jewish source, not a Christian one. Josephus had no reason to fabricate Christian martyrdoms. Second, he confirms that Jesus was called Christ. That is, that Jesus' followers claimed he was the Messiah. And third, he records that James, Jesus' brother, was executed by Jewish authorities around AD 62. But here's what makes this particularly powerful. James was Jesus' brother. He grew up with Jesus. And John 7 and verse 5 says that during Jesus' ministry, his brothers didn't believe him. They thought he was crazy. So what changed James's mind? What could convince a man to believe his own brother was the Messiah, a claim so outrageous that he was willing to die for it? James said it was a resurrection. 1 Corinthians 15:7 tells us Jesus appeared to James after rising from the dead, and that appearance changed everything. James became a leader of the Jerusalem church, and when given the choice to deny Jesus or die, he chose death. And we know this not just from Christian sources, but from a Jewish historian who recorded it. There are other ancient sources as well. Suetonius, I guess that's how you pronounce that. Suetonius.
I've always called it
Suetonius, another Roman historian writing around AD 120, mentions that Claudius expelled Jews from Rome because of disturbances, quote, instigated by Chrestus. You remember that misnaming or misspelling, which is likely a reference to Christ. And he confirms that Nero punished the Christians, a class of men given a new and mischievous superstition, quote unquote. So that was, again, Suetonius. Juvenal, sorry, a Roman poet references Christians being burned alive with a mocking tone. Lucian, a Greek satirist writing around AD 165, mocks Christians but confirms they worshipped that crucified sophist and shows contempt for their willingness to die for their beliefs.
Sound like a late night comedian talking about the death of Charlie Kirk in the last few months.
Yeah. These mockers, they're cowards, really, you know. Epictetus, Epictetus, and like Epicletus or something, and like some like important redneck. The Stoic philosopher mentions Christians' fearlessness in the face of death, though he attributes it to madness or habituation. All of these are hostile sources. Clearly, none of them are Christians. They don't speak glowingly. All of them thought Christianity was foolish, but all of them confirmed that Christians were being persecuted and that they faced it with remarkable courage. Why does all this matter so much? Why is hostile witness testimony so powerful? 4 reasons. Reason number 1, they gain nothing by confirming Christian claims. Tacitus, Pliny, Josephus, none of them benefit from making Christianity look good. In fact, it's the opposite. They're explaining why Christians are troublemakers, why they deserve punishment. If anything, they'd want to minimize Christian suffering to make their own government look less cruel. But they don't. They confirm it in graphic detail. Reason number 2, they're writing to audiences who could fact check them. These aren't obscure texts written centuries later. Tacitus was writing within living memory of Nero's persecution to a Roman audience that would remember it. Pliny was writing to the emperor about a current situation. If they were lying or exaggerating, they'd be called out. Reason number 3, if Christians weren't really dying, these writers would know. These are not distant, uninformed observers. Tacitus had access to Roman archives. Pliny was personally conducting the trials. Josephus was connected with the Jewish leadership. If the persecution wasn't real, they'd know, and they'd say so. But they don't dispute it. They confirm it. And reason number 4, this is like prosecution witnesses confirming the defense's alibi. So imagine a murder trial where the defendant says, I wasn't there. I was at work, and my coworkers can confirm it. That's good. But now imagine the prosecution's own witness testify, yeah, we checked. He really was at work. Well, case closed. That's what we have here. Christianity's enemies confirm the very facts Christians claim, that they were persecuted, that they could escape by recanting, and that they chose death instead. So now we come to Paley's devastating question. Here's what we know for certain, confirmed even by hostile sources. Christians were persecuted, beaten, imprisoned, tortured, executed. They could have escaped this by simply denying Christ, and they refused. The question is why? If the resurrection was a lie, if they knew they had made it up, why would they endure this when they could escape by recanting? So we think about human nature. When people are tortured, they confess. When people face death, they compromise. When people have an easy way out, they take it. But the apostles and early Christians didn't. Not one of them recanted. Not one of them said, okay, we made it up. Just stop hurting me. Sorry. That was that slide. So again, and think about this too. I think a critical part of this that maybe we're not thinking about enough, but I'll highlight it here, is if these people didn't think that there was a life after this one, that there was a reward waiting for them after death, then really it benefited them nothing in this life to say, you know what, nah, I'll take back what I said, right? So if they didn't actually believe that there was a life after this one and that there was a reward waiting for them, but they did, and that's why they went to their deaths, because they knew that if they recanted, well, you know, there's no other apart from Jesus that has any saving power. There's no one else that can save except for him. And so if they deny Christ, well, what hope is there? But the very opposite is true as well. If you're willing to die for Christ, if you go to your death saying, yes, I believe, I mean, I don't know how much more can be expected of a Christian than to be faithful unto death. So again, the very fact that they were willing to die is an unspoken acknowledgement that they believed that there was a reward waiting for them if they stayed the course, if they finished the race. Okay, sorry. So the critical distinction, here's the critical distinction that Paley makes. People die for false beliefs all the time. Muslim martyrs believe Islam is true. Buddhist monks believe their philosophy. Modern cult members believe their leader's teaching, and they die for these beliefs sincerely. But they could be wrong, and they wouldn't know it. But the apostles claimed to be eyewitnesses. They didn't say, we believe Jesus rose. They said, we saw him alive. We touched him. We ate with him. That's not a belief that you can be mistaken about. You know whether you saw someone alive or not. There's no room for sincere error. So either they're telling the truth, they really saw him, or they were lying and they made it up. There's no middle ground. And if they're lying, they knew that they were lying, and they chose torture and death rather than admit it. Does that make any sense? Or is the simpler explanation that they died because they knew it was true, because they had seen Jesus alive with their own eyes, and no amount of torture could make them deny what they knew? All right, so that's a good place to stop. There are some questions for us, and I'll just flash them up on the screen. We're out of time, can't really go into too much, but I thought these were pretty good questions. Maybe these are questions we don't want to necessarily, think about too much.
May I make a comment, sort of tangential, but it has to do with
Sure.
an earlier remark? The way I remember, and maybe it's a revisionist memory, when COVID struck,
Oh, yeah.
and it caught us all by surprise.
Mm-hmm.
It happened so quickly. We were trying to follow the best expert testimony. Of course, at the time, when it first happened, we had in the White House a good guy at
Mm-hmm.
the time, when it first, at the very beginning of it. I think we made the decision not to meet for a few weeks, not so much out of fear of the state police coming in and shutting us down like they did in Statesboro,
Yeah.
or tried to, but this black church courageously said, you can put us in jail. But they met anyway, so
Yeah.
Kemp backed off. But I think it was because we didn't want to meet while all of our friends and neighbors who also were taken aback by all this would look down on us and be horrified that we're so antisocial. We don't care if we are spreading a pandemic, So
Yeah.
at the time it was all new, and they were telling us that if you get together in groups, you're going to kill your grandmother,
Yeah.
and that sort of stuff. So I'm not trying to I'm not trying to put too much of a good light on, but in our defense, I
Yeah.
think that's what our motive was more than fear of the police.
Yeah, no, and I didn't mean to phrase it like that. There was never any fear that we were going to come and get, shut down by the government, that, we're going to get arrested. I don't
Well,
think
they
so.
could have had we been meeting. I mean, they did do that.
Yeah, but Christmas, we weren't afraid. If they did it, they did it. We'd still
Yeah,
do it. If we
I think, we did it, out of, I- and you're right. I mean, we made that decision. Well, taking everything in consideration, we're trying to make the best decision. But I think we very quickly realized that all of that was just a lie. It was a farce. And so we said, no, what? We're getting together. We're coming back together. So I'm trying to put a good spin on, we kind of, out of trying to be, nice and trying to be deferential. And really, though, ultimately, all that was based on a lie. And we didn't know at the time. But
That's what I was going to say. What if it had been true?
Mhm.
We had still had.
Yeah. But I think that we understood after, how many ever missed Sundays, although we did get together, electronically, we said, you know what, this is just, we can't do this. This is not right. And, regardless of the consequences. But I think we'd already seen that, this thing wasn't like Ebola. People weren't, falling down dead in the streets. So again, we could have, we could have been, shut down. Government could have, like they did in Minnesota, wasn't it? Or Illinois. Where is it? Where are they having all the trouble with the riots? Yeah, Minnesota. The governor were throwing people into jail. Out in California, people throwing people into jail, arresting them, shutting down churches for that kind of stuff in all the blue states. The only people that ever really need to follow the law are the law-abiding citizens. If you're here illegally, if you're a lawbreaker, then we're not going to touch you. In fact, we're going to give you special rights. So, we being good representatives of Christianity, trying to, be a good example to others around about us, I think we made that decision. But I think we quickly realized that, what, whether it's better to obey God than man, we'll leave that up for people to make up their own minds. But
expects us to use common sense.
Yeah.
Until we had all the facts, we didn't want to be.
Yeah. I'm not saying, yeah, and just to be clear, I don't think we did nothing wrong. I think we made the best possible decision. I still stand by that. I just think that, again,
But it was with Discord. So.
we were put into a difficult position. And I promise you that if we had known then what we know now, we probably would have never skipped a Sunday. Yeah. But, we learned from that. And I hope that the entire planet, at least this country, has learned from that experience that is how, we get manipulated into submission and acquiescing to the government's demands. So, but no,
The people on the left were highly judgmental then of the courageous few who met despite the bans.
mhm.
They would basically use the same kind of phrase. Said they're hateful to all men. They don't care about humanity.
Exactly. You're exactly right. You're just, you hate people because you want to go and get together and meet, even though this terrible plague, those are the same people that are still wearing masks today in their car. And so I'm really glad that they have decided. Yeah, I'm really glad they have decided to mark themselves, because that is, who to stay away from, right? We didn't have to do it. We didn't have to make them wear something special to distinguish themselves. They've decided to don their own special attire. They put on their suit of armor, that nasty rag that they're breathing through, getting repeatedly infected with anyway, sorry. And it's sad now, because people now looking back at it, it's safe enough now where people can actually go back. You know what? yeah, those face masks really didn't do anything, and they were nasty, and they were keeping people sick, and but now they're not gonna come back and say they're sorry. And I'm sorry this has turned into a diatribe about COVID, but anyway, no, no. So those are the key takeaways, and next week the resurrection evidence. We'll start part 1 of that, which will be. Excuse me, I got to get to my. We'll look directly at the resurrection itself. We're going to examine the evidence step by step. Jesus really died by crucifixion. Even skeptics acknowledge this. The tomb was really found empty. Even enemies acknowledge this. Multiple people had experiences that they believed were experiences or appearances of the risen Jesus, and these facts demand an explanation. We're going to see that the resurrection is actually the best explanation of the facts, not the most miraculous, maybe, but the most coherent, the most logical, the one that accounts for all the evidence. So we'll talk about that next week.
Experts and historians on Christian apologetics
Mm-hmm.
have a consensus that Paley's work was the high watermark of all the many kinds of evidences that had been coming out for decades prior, throughout the 18th century, and even back into the 17th, 16th, well, 17th century anyway, beginning of the Enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is really good. You forget old Paley, I mean, because the language is a little difficult. It's taxing for us.
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of you remember you read him years ago, then you go back, start seeing, you think, no wonder he was so well thought of in his day. And today the left, instead of so much attacking him, is just basically totally ignoring what he wrote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And especially if you read that simple English, I'm going to make that link available so you can scan it in. But let me